Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us. It's a bit of a funny time of year, isn't it, in the summer holidays? And we do have all of this disruption and unrest and generally nasty stuff going on in the UK. But nevertheless, we are going to enjoy ourselves tonight, and we are going to talk to Sara Boon, who is going to talk to us about her new book, all about being both autistic and ADHD. I just want to introduce Autistic Girls Network to you first, in case you don't know much about us. We are a very small, pretty young charity that supports autistic girls and women and their families and campaigns for earlier diagnosis, because girls are generally recognised a lot later than boys. And I think probably Sara is going to talk about that tonight. So we are, as I said, a charity. Some of you have donated, and that's brilliant. But these webinars are free always, and nobody should feel that they have to donate. That's really important. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over. This is Sara Boon. She is a brand new published author and blogger, and she's going to talk to us tonight about her new book. And I will let her introduce that because she can do it a lot better than me. Over to you, Sara.
Thanks, Kathy. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. And yeah, as of a few weeks ago, I became a published author and published my first book, Young, Autistic and ADHD, Moving into Adulthood When You're Multiply Neurodivergent. And ultimately what the book is about is that kind of point where you come up to the end of adolescence and we move and start on our adult lives. And a lot of this book kind of was, the idea came from my own experiences. As in that point of my life, I didn't know I was autistic and ADHD, and it's looking back now, I think, oh my gosh, there's so much I could have known, should have known, that would have made that time in my life a lot easier. So that's where the books come from, and it covers a variety of different things. So it first starts off talking about, you know, what autism and ADHD is, as again, there's a lot of late diagnosis or people not realizing until they're a little bit older. So we cover that. To start with, we also look at common things we perhaps have more challenges with, like executive functioning, decision making, relationships, emotional well-being, and identity and acceptance as well. So that's my little overview of the book.
Sorry, I realised I'd turned my camera off and I meant to be asking you questions. That's not very good, is it? So how did you come to be, now I was going to say diagnosed, but actually I prefer to say recognised, but I think you do actually have medical diagnosis. How did you come to be recognised as both autistic and ADHD?
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite a long journey. So originally, I was actually first assessed for autism when I was 4 and I was misdiagnosed. So, and again, this would have been like 1999, 2000. So this is ages ago when you think about it, you know, before anyone really knew, you know, how common it was for autistic women and women with ADHD to exist. It wasn't really on anyone's radar at that point, because I had speech delay. So again, it was just all put down to that. And then I think it was like a language disorder they put it down as, and then that was it. So kind of again went through kind of all my childhood not knowing I was either autistic or ADHD, really wasn't on anyone's radar. And I think it wasn't until I was about 23 when I started questioning. And I think I was kind of coming to the point where I was realizing and accepting just like how much I was struggling with socializing and how little like I could manage compared to other people. So I think that's where it really started. And then again, I was doing research, and at that point, like a few things were coming up, but I was like kind of relating to this, but not really. So I was like, I'm not sure if I am autistic or not. I was umming and ahhing for ages until I saw the first thing. I think it was my YouTube. Like, you know, when it comes up in the suggestions, it had a specific woman about autism and women and girls. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard anything about that. So I just clicked on it. And then that video was felt like my life story at that point. And then there was kind of no doubt in my mind. So again, from that eventually did lead to me getting my diagnosis, autism first, at 24. And then I feel like it was at that point where I started interacting more with other autistic people and kind of wider autistic communities online, is where I was starting to see more about ADHD, and then actually relating to those experiences too, because I think there's some parts of autism that I didn't relate to as much. I think the key one for me is like the routines. I don't feel like I'm that routine bound, but I think that is because of my ADHD, and it's little things like that as well. And then when I was specifically hearing about autistic people who also had ADHD, I was like, it kind of clicked. And then I eventually did get that diagnosis as well. So yeah, it was a very long journey, a period of time, but got there in the end, understood what was going on.
Yes, it can be a very, very long journey, can't it?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think, or maybe you don't think, maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, maybe you don't think there are any consequences, but what I was going to say is, what do you think the consequences are of not being recognised when you were 4, or later, because it was a very long, it was 20 years later that you were actually
It's a really
recognised.
long time.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the consequences would have, huge. I think my life would have been really different. Again, I'm not convinced it would have been positive, and I think necessarily if I was diagnosed younger, but I think that's mainly because of the schools I was in, and the kind of the attitudes that are around at that time, because obviously I wasn't recently within the school system. It has been a little bit of time for myself now. I think it was 13 years ago since I left secondary school now. And it's interesting because I have spoken to people who were in the same schools with a diagnosis, and I would say our experiences were quite different, but they both negative. So I think on a personal level, it may have been, I think it would have been helpful to understand why. Because again, I think it was really difficult in terms of, not knowing why I was different, why I was struggling to fit in, and, kind of just feeling defective because of it. So I think knowing to some extent, like that would have been helpful on a personal level. But again, I think back to how I was, even in my teens, I think if I was told as like a younger teenager, I definitely would have rejected it, because I was like, the masking was so high and I felt so much pressure to fit in. I would have felt that would have been a barrier to that if I got a diagnosis at that point. So I think it's a double-sided coin in some ways. Yes, it would have been better. And again, it would have been probably easier to navigate certain things, but then in other ways, I probably would have faced a different type of discrimination, not knowing. But then you're still discriminated whether you're diagnosed or not. It just can, I think, manifest in a different way if people know or if people don't know.
Yeah. Do you think that if it was now, if it was the school system now, do you think that would have made any difference? Do you think we've come, in 20 years, we have come quite a long way, haven't we?
Mm-hmm. If I'm being honest, I think it would entirely depend on the school, if I'm being brutally honest, because some are better than others. I feel like with education, there's still a heck of a long way to go when it comes to understanding neurodiversity and neurodivergent students. But I think being in the right education environment, probably, again, I think, and the attitudes of the people, like the teachers and the staff around you towards neurodivergent students, I think that would have been the key, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I understand. What do you think is different about being both autistic and ADHD in comparison to being only autistic or only ADHD? Obviously, you are neither of the last two.
Yes.
But you've done loads and loads of research, and I know that you'll understand what I'm asking.
Yeah. So what I think is some of the key things is, again, it's you're not entirely fitting into like autism or ADHD. I kind of did touch on this earlier, but I think, I don't fully relate to kind of stereotypical view of autism, but I don't fully fit into that box of ADHD either. it is kind of a combination of the two. I feel like the best way to describe it, I did tweet this the other day, is it's organized chaos, but the chaos is organized. Like, that's the simplest way I can describe ADHD. And I've seen people give examples of, like, they'll have like piles of paper everywhere, but they'll be neatly organized piles. And again, I think that really just
don't look next to my computer at the moment and see all the piles of paper.
Yeah, honestly, just before this, I was like clearing stuff out the way, because like on the shelf behind me, there was stuff everywhere. On the parts of the desk you can't see right now, there is stuff everywhere.
Yeah, I do aspire to clear surfaces.
Oh, when I do it, it lasts maybe a few days at best.
Yes. And what's your view? And of course, it's only an opinion, just as I have an opinion on this. What's your view about, where are we gonna be in 10 years' time? Are we gonna be thinking that autism and ADHD are different parts of the same thing? Or do you think that they are separate? What's your feeling about that?
Oh, but this is such a good question. I think it potentially will be recognised as its own thing. I don't think it will replace autism and ADHD, but I think what I'd love to see is it it be recognised as you can have both, and that's different. Again, I think it'd be really helpful for those people who do want or need a diagnosis or going through that formal process, if both assessments are just done at the same time. Because when you look at the statistics, I mean, they do vary depending where you look at, but again, it is really high numbers that are both. I almost think, like, if you think you're possibly one, it should almost be like a defact, let's see the other as well, let's do it all in one go, rather than just having like separate assessments.
The thing is, it makes it all very difficult, doesn't it, to kind of pick apart what is autism and what is ADHD. Because we posted something on our social media channels today about executive function, and we had quite a few comments for saying, oh, this is related to ADHD as well. And yes, it is, but equally up to 70% of autistic people are also ADHDers. So who's to say which part of it is that talking about? So it is very difficult. What's also very difficult, though, when you're talking about, perhaps a separate diagnosis of ADHD, is, of course, a lot of autistic and ADHD people also have dyspraxia or also have dyslexia. And so, where do you stop with the combined?
Where do you draw the line? And again, I feel like that is a massive whole debate probably within itself.
Oh yeah, that's probably a 50-year debate, that, I should imagine.
I mean, I feel like that's a one that's like that could be like almost like a whole like academic PhD thesis type thing, looking into that debate, I guess, and where fits into what. But I think this is the thing, it's not 100%. I don't think you can fully separate the two. I couldn't do it with my own. I can't fully separate ADHD.
No, and when you think back and you realise that it's only since 2013 that people have been able to be diagnosed with both. All that tells you is that we didn't actually know what we were talking about at all. None of the so-called experts knew what they were talking about, because before 2013 it was refused to have a diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. Now we know most people are. In 10 years' time, what will be the truth? I don't know.
It could be completely different, but
I know, it will be interesting, won't it?
Yeah, but I think it's just the fact so many are both. And I was like, there's got to be a link between the two. Again, science definitely doesn't have the answers yet. But yeah, it's something I'm fascinated to see what happens kind of going forward. As well.
Yes, I am. So before we move on to talking more about what's in the book, I'm sure some of this is in the book too, but let's talk a little bit about your kind of education journey, because I know being unrecognised and unsupported as neurodivergent will have made that difficult.
Yeah. It was definitely very difficult, but I think the thing looking back now was I felt like the only person in the world having those difficulties at the time. Obviously, this was a time before pre-internet, before, you know, autism and ADHD were talked about more mainstream. You know, I don't think even many people would have known the words neurodiversity or neurodivergent. Again, because yeah, when I was, I think, you know, they were only starting to talk about the 90s, and that was only in very small certain circles as well. So again, just wasn't on anyone's radar. So again, I think that was an incredibly isolating experience, even though now I know actually loads of people go through the same difficulties I had and experiences that I had in the education system. And I think that's one thing that's actually been really validating as an adult, you know. And the first time I felt like I got that validation, or any form of validation of like how difficult that was actually during my autism assessment, which is crazy because that was years after I was out of school. And again, because I was someone who heavily masked so much, again, I was like never seen as a problem. Oh, perfectly behaved, you know, all of that, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And some of the people here who perhaps know neurodivergent people who mask in school. But I just remember, particularly the first 2 years of secondary school, I would come home and have like several hour long meltdowns for a very long time, and they were very intense. And again, that was like the impact of the school day. Again, I used to fake being sick so I could have days off school, but I was very well aware, you know, if I was off school too long, that they would come down on my parents, and I didn't want that. So again, I was really strategic in terms of when I was sick, to have that time off, but then to not have a knock-on effect of the family. So it's always things, and again, I know you'll be familiar with this, Kathy, as well. Again, to try and avoid school. And it's looking back now, when I think about it, I was like, probably the best thing I could have done with my mental health if I just became, I know I'm not a massive fan of the term, but a school refuser. Because I think when I think of the mental health damage that's had long term into like my adult years now, like it still affects me to this day. That was probably could have been the best thing. I mean, I was just in completely the wrong environment. And again, that just hasn't been recognised till now. But even though I know, well, I mean, up until the election, I know the current that government were being very harsh on families. Again, I don't know if that's going to change or not. I think it's too early to tell. In terms of, you know, behaviour policies, attendance policies, and the impact as well. And you know, those are all just red flags for me when I see it based on my experience. And I know, again, they can come down really hard on other people as well.
Yeah, and what would you like to change about the education system? Presumably the behaviour and attendance
Oh yeah,
policy.
I think to be honest, it needs almost like a whole revolution within itself. Again, obviously, you know, I think having strict like behaviour policies again doesn't help at all, and having very kind of punitive responses, I feel sometimes. Again, I think education just needs to be so much more nurturing places as well. I think as well, in terms of the, you know, education, I think it just needs to be in terms of the ways how lessons are taught, so they're more inclusive for neurodivergent people, the environment as well. I mean, it's cultural attitudes as well. Like it requires so much change. It's just like, where do you begin? Because again, these are like society-wide issues that affect how schools are, in my view. So I think schools are a lot more, you know, flexible, a lot more compassionate is what we need. I think one that's definitely less results driven and like so focused on like GCSEs and stuff. I mean, GCSEs was something like I got through, but if I'm being honest, now as an adult, I barely remember anything I learned in them. You know, they're not that useful for my day-to-day life. So why are we putting so much pressure on young people at that stage of their lives? You know, I think it's all these things that we need to think about, really. But yeah, I think I'm at the point where I'm just like, scrap it all and let's just start again. Let's just create something new. You know, I think, and again, I'm speaking particularly for the UK, but I'm sure this is relevant to schools.
Yes, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. And that's kind of multiple systems, isn't it, that need changing? Because if we're going to, well, perhaps we're not going to, but if we were to kind of revolutionize the education system so much that we weren't dependent on GCSEs and A levels to get to kind of the next step, the next rung of the ladder, if you like, then we need a different employment environment, don't we? Which also doesn't, and a different further education environment, which doesn't necessitate you having 3 A levels, to get to university, etc., etc. And it's all doable, but is there an appetite to do it? I'm not sure.
I think it's just if there's enough appetite. Because I mean, I know a certain amount of people have an appetite. It's just, do enough people have an appetite?
There's certainly an increasing amount of, things like self-directed learning centres and stuff like that, that I think is really, really important. And, it's something that Autistic Girls Network would like to. That's one of our long-term aims, is to open schools, alternative provisions, depending on, what they're going to actually look like in the end, that are more appropriate to somebody who perhaps wants a mainstream curriculum but can't cope with a mainstream school.
Because again, I think
there will. Sorry.
No, it's like, again, I think I see that where there is almost a gap, because there are a lot of people who can't cope in a mainstream environment, but again, the mainstream curriculum is the right way to go for them.
There are a lot of very, very intelligent young people who, who want to do particular subjects, for example, but they're being crushed in a system that makes them want to do, oh no, if you want to do physics, you have to do X, Y, Z. If you're not going to attend, if you're going to have EOTAS, education other than at school, you can't do 10 GCSEs, things like that, and I know that that's happening because that's happening to my nephew, who has an education other than at school, EHCP, but is being told that he can't do the 10 GCSEs that he wants to do, that he is perfectly capable of doing. And why? Why are we putting people into these boxes?
I know.
Right, so let's talk more about the book now. So first of all, let's discuss why you wanted to, what made you write the book.
So in terms of wanting to write this book, I think I've always liked the idea of writing a book, but again, it hadn't really come to me for ages. It's, some of those thoughts in the back of my head, like, oh, I'd like to write a book, that'll ever happen, but I think as well, it's when I was kind of discovering my own, like, oh, I'm autistic, and then later I'm ADHD. Again, I did a lot of thinking, and again, it really started from my blog, and again, I'd blog about certain topics, and then again, I think this has probably been one of the most popular blog posts. I was like, did my autism mask my ADHD and vice versa? And again, so I did like a short blog post about it, and then I thought, actually, there's probably a lot more to write here, or like there's a lot more to it. So again, that's when I thought, should I write this as a book? And then again, I can't remember how long it was after that, but then again, I started having initial conversations with the publisher before they commissioned the book. They liked the idea, and then we kind of talked about it, and then that's where the idea about kind of focusing it on like young adulthood and those challenges there really came in as well. As again, ADHD is a really broad topic, but I guess it was just thinking about kind of what I knew and my experiences around ADHD. So again, I think I was probably, I was kind of start of my like late 20s, probably late mid-20s, when I was kind of thinking about this. And then I thought, right, well, I was like, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster since I was been 18 up to that point. And again, I was like, there's so much I know now that if I just knew a few years before, it would have been a lot easier, a lot smoother. So that's why, again, I decided to focus on young adulthood and those years. with the book.
So pick out for us then the kind of the hot topics that you talk about
Mm-hmm.
in the book that are, you know, that you found really the most important for those going into adulthood.
Yeah, so I think a big one has to be relationships. Because again, I think that relationships can be difficult. You know, if you're neurotypical, neurodivergent, whatever. But I do feel with being ADHD, it's just there's another level. There's so many more complexities to it. There's new types of relationships that we haven't had before. And again, it can be really difficult to kind of navigate. And I think a lot of it is, again, we're kind of assumed that we just know all this information, like no one really tells us. So again, in this book, I guess it's just like laying those like initial foundations as a starting point, really, in terms of navigating things like workplace relationships or, you know, romantic relationships that we're perhaps having for the first time. So again, I think that's a really important part of the book. I think also as well, we talk a lot about emotional well-being and mental health. Again, I know we've touched on it a little bit already, but you know, a lot of autistic ADHDers do have those more likely to have difficulties in mental health. It's definitely separate from the autism and ADHD. I think that's really important to note. But I think when we think about the challenges we can kind of have in our world, you know, the discrimination we face, I reckon a lot of us have probably been bullied quite significantly as well over our years. So again, that all has an impact. And then, you know, many of us will have other things going on in our lives as well as being neurodivergent. So again, it was really talking, you know, about those things, but then also as well if how certain mental health treatments, again, aren't always necessarily designed for us in mind. I know we focus on CBT a little bit and some of the difficulties people had with that. And again, I know it's really common for services to say, oh, this person's not engaging, so then they'll discharge them. But actually, were they actually making any adaptations in the first place? Is this the right approach for this person because they're autistic and ADHD? It's things like that. And then we talk a little bit as well about, you know, coexisting mental health and also misdiagnosis of mental health when actually it's autism and ADHD. And I know BPD, borderline personality disorder, can be a common one for that as well. So again, we kind of talk those things through, and I think that really comes from you know, people's experiences. I spoke to several people and interviewed them for the book as well, other young ADHDers. So again, it's not just kind of based solely on mine, it is based on other people's experiences as well. Because again, you know, none of us are identical. And again, I think that really does add a lot of value to the book and in terms of understanding people's experiences. And then also we also talk about identity and acceptance, because I think as well it can be so difficult when everything about your differences is either you know, stigmatized, you know, you've been bullied about it, you face discrimination, and again it can be really hard, but actually there can be positive things as well. And I think it's really important to, you know, focus on that and, you know, be able to be more self-accepting of ourselves. And again, that's not easy, and the book definitely acknowledges that. But actually, you know, we're not defective humans because of our differences. The world may make us feel that way a lot of the time, but actually, you know, there can be positives. We can still have self-esteem and be proud of ourselves for who we are. And again, I think and again, that's is the final chapter before the conclusion. But I think it's just really important, you know, to talk about those things, you know, both the positives and the negatives as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I put myself on mute because I've got one dog who's snoring and one dog who's whining. So nobody wants to hear that. I don't want to hear that either. So if let's imagine that you are talking to a young adult ADHD. What would kind of the key points be that you'd say to them, you know, this is a really good thing to bear in mind as you're going into adulthood?
Mm-hmm. I think the key thing I would probably say is working out. It's so important to work out what's best for you as a neurodivergent person rather than just following the norm. And I think that was probably one of my biggest hiccups when I was, I guess, you know, fresh out of education going into the world. And I think about it now, and things did fall apart quite quickly in some ways. So and difficulties, and that's because I was following the normal path, and then I realized very quickly that this isn't going to provide me happiness. It's just going to destroy my mental health, and I can't exist long term like this as well. So again, I think it's really getting to understand yourself, and what is kind of again it could be trial and error, but it's really working out how to make your life work for you as a neurodivergent person. And again, that won't be identical for every ADHDer, and there are unique aspects to that. But I think as well, just abandoning the idea of normal was probably one of the best things I ever did. Again, some young people won't like that necessarily if you say it to them that directly, because again, I think especially if they're really focused on normal, that's something they really value in that time of life. It can be a bit of a backlash, as sometimes again you can't just say that as directly as to some people, even though if I'm thinking about my younger self, that's probably what I did need to hear at that time. But again, you could even just be focused on what's not working, what would work for you, let's look at this together. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. But yeah, I
think some of these things only come with maturity as well, don't they? I think if you're 15, it's perfectly normal to be kind of almost obsessed with your friends and to kind of want to do anything. I'm really old now, and I remember vividly being at my grandparents' house and desperately wanting to be somewhere else because I knew that my friends were doing something. And I think it's hard to turn your back on that when you're 15, but as you get older and you get more mature, you are more able, I think, to advocate for yourself and to say, no, actually, I don't want to do that. I am going to stay in rather than do whatever they're doing. But I think, that's a really, really hard thing to do at 15, isn't it?
It's super hard. It is super hard. And again, I think my 15-year-old self would have rejected it. But again, I think, I think it's particular once I left education in the real world, I think that's what it really did sunk in for me. And I was like, I didn't necessarily kind of fully understand it, but I think that's when I realized that day-to-day life, or like how normal it is for adults, just wasn't going to work for me.
Yeah. And let's flip that question around a little bit, and imagine that you're talking to parents now. What would you like parents to know, or what do you think that parents could put in place to make that transition to adulthood easier for their ADHD?
Again, I think it's a really good question. There probably isn't one straightforward answer, but I think one key thing you could probably do is help that young person to kind of understand as much as they can about autism and ADHD at that point. I totally appreciate that young people will not be open to it. And again, it has to be, or again, that conversation may come later down the road, or it may have to be on their terms, which again is absolutely fine. So I think time and patience is key. It's totally okay if they don't hit certain milestones by certain points. I think there's a lot of pressure on that. So, if someone wants to take several years out before maybe they think about going to higher education, that's totally okay. There's no rush to make a decision. You could perhaps do things, part-time when going into adulthood. It's all these different things that you can think about. But I think, let's say we'll take your hypothetical 15-year-old ADHD. I think, at that point, it's really just, working with them. I think, learning what their interests are, thinking about, what do they enjoy doing, where are potential areas they can thrive, what do they feel is good for them, and just following that lead and see where it goes. It's probably the best thing I could say. And, if there are difficulties along the road, if there is burnout, if there is mental health, I think it's so important to give that space and not to put any time pressure to recover. Again, I know there can be a lot of things, they'll just have a break, but then they'll have to go back to school, and when the next term is in 2 months' time or whatever, I think you've got to take all those pressures off and just allow time to breathe. as well. I think that's one thing I felt I definitely needed just coming out of school. Like I just needed that space to almost breathe and recover once I was finding out that system. So again, I think a lot of young ADHDers may need that. So again, I think it's really important just to respect that space before thinking about longer term, you know, what options they may want to do as they go into adulthood.
Sorry, just trying to get my dog to go under the desk there. Oh, she's gone again.
Yeah.
Okay, so we haven't really talked much about, well, we haven't talked at all, have we, about employment and like moving on from school and further education. What, you know, how was that for you, that transition into employment? How was that for you? And what do you wish that employers knew more about in terms of neurodivergency?
Yeah. So when I think about kind of, I guess, my first experience of employment, I was definitely job hopping a lot, but that's because I think I didn't understand what my needs were, because I still didn't know I was neurodivergent for the first few years I was working. So again, I would bounce around the thing thinking, oh, this has to be better, this has to be better, but I wasn't really understanding, you know, why I was finding certain things difficult. So again, I think something, when I look back now, I think, okay, long commutes, can't do them. That, you know, that was really inaccessible to me. And every time I've had a job that's long commute, again, that actually had a huge impact on my mental health, and I couldn't sustain those jobs. Again, I think something else I learned about, I mean, for several years I was kind of working part-time and I was self-employed part-time. I actually found that worked really well for myself in some ways, because again, I think my ADHD kind of seeks variety. So the fact I wasn't only focusing on one thing at a time personally really suited me. I appreciate that's kind of quite a unique situation, but I think often when you're neurodivergent, that's the way to go about it. And I know a lot of neurodivergent people are self-employed, or they find that's the only way forward for them, because traditional employment can be quite kind of rigid in terms of how it works, you know, what hours you work, where you work, what time you do certain tasks throughout the day. And again, it may not fit in with how our brains work. So, and again, I think, you know, for people in the workplace, I do think there needs to be like flexibility around that. And I know that some employers are definitely better than others. And I think when I think back about my own employment experiences, you know, I found the more flexible employment has been, you know, the longer I am able to sustain it. You know, I am in those jobs for longer. So I think that is something that's really important, I guess, for employers. I forgot what the question was. I knew I had more to say. Do you mind just saying it again, Kathy? I mean,
it was, what do you think is really important for employers to know about neurodivergency? And we could talk about, you know, reasonable adjustments. Have you had good experience of reasonable adjustments being put in place?
Yeah, so again, I would say it's completely mixed. I mean, when I didn't know I was an ADHD, again, I didn't know that I could even ask for reasonable adjustments, or I needed them, or what they could be. But I think, you know, now I would say it's massively varied. Like some will, some won't. Some will ask, or some you'd have to actively go out of your way and ask. I know that some people, again, one example actually from the recruitment process, which I almost think is a deal breaker for me now in terms of if I get through a job interview, is having the questions in advance. Now, I know some people are absolutely fine with that. Others will flat out say no. And they won't do that, which is really frustrating. But also what I find with that is sometimes some people send the questions way in advance, but then other people will literally send it to you like half an hour before. So then you don't have time to prepare. And again, that's not necessarily something you always have control of. I think if you give people enough notice, then they should give it to you within a decent amount of time, or a time frame that works for you. But again, that doesn't always happen. I remember once I found out that they didn't, when I asked that reasonable adjustment, they said no, but that's because they hadn't even written the questions for the interview far enough in advance to give it to me in advance. So again, I would say that's probably beyond a reasonable adjustment thing. That's just, you know, the people interviewing weren't prepared enough for the interview. But again, I think, you know, it really starts, it starts way before you're actually in the job. You know, it starts almost from the start of the recruitment process in terms of those reasonable adjustments. And again, obviously, and no, but then again, you can get some employers who may do the reasonable adjustments in interviews, but then not necessarily put them in place when you're at work as well. So yeah, I think it's a really mixed bag, but I do feel like things like asking questions for advance, I'd say even compared to a few years ago, I think it is slightly more accepted now. But it feels
Yeah,
small. But
a
I
lot
really
of
hope that,
charities say that they do that in recruitment. We've not
yeah.
recruited
And I
anyone
think
yet, so we've not done it yet. Well, only
but
me.
yeah. But I think as well, in some ways, I think it's because I know some people will just do it blanket, they'll just do it for everyone, which is better because sometimes it can feel really awkward to ask things like that in advance. And it can be really difficult. I think especially when you're autistic and like navigating social situations, like sometimes something like that I do really struggle with in terms of, I guess, advocating for myself in the moment. So if it's just a blanket, we give it to everyone. Again, I think that's a really positive step because it removes that anxiety of having to ask when perhaps that's more difficult for you. And as well, it shouldn't be this way, but you know, some people will say like people getting reasonable adjustments is special treatment or it's favorable treatment, but it's not at all. You know, it's making sure that we all have an equal playing field with what we've got. So yeah, I mean, it can be a minefield, I think, in terms of all these different things, you know, whether to ask for reasonable adjustments or not, whether to disclose or not, because sometimes they do have the options to disclose, and that can be really difficult to figure out, is it in my best interest? Applying, I would say, even to applying for this job at this company, because it could be massively different. I mean, I work kind of in the area of autism, so I always do disclose. And I mean, if I'm being honest, if you just type my name into Google, it's pretty obvious as well. So, you know, I do, but you know, but again, there's still a lot of stigma out there. You know, it could be industry specific as well. So it's all these things that you got to think about. It's not as straightforward.
No, definitely not. Definitely. Okay, well, last question then. Oh, because it's quite late, and I did want to leave a little bit of time for questions from everyone else. What is the one thing or two things, if you can't choose one, that you would like the reader to take away from your book?
Mm-hmm. I think what I would like the reader to take away from the book is that they're not alone in their experiences, and that actually, you know, some of the things that they may find it hard to talk about or accept about themselves, you know, are valid. You know, it is real and it is okay, you know, to be this way. I think
Yeah.
ultimately that's what I'd like people to take away.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good thing to take away. Okay, I'm going to open to questions then. So if anyone's got a question, please do feel free to type it in the chat and we'll see what there is. Oh, do hold up have you got a copy of your book there, Sarah?
Yeah. Do we hold it up?
Yeah, do hold it up. Here we go. So this is, I can't see what the longer title is at the bottom. Can you read it out?
The subtitle, there we go.
Oh yeah, moving into adulthood when you're multiply neurodivergent.
Yeah.
Which is my favourite phrase, multiply neurodivergent. I more often say very few people are singly neurodivergent, is what I say quite a lot.
It's true. It's so true though. It's so
It is
true.
so true. And you know, often if that's the only diagnosis they've got, it's quite likely because they just haven't got the other diagnoses.
Yeah.
But you know, obviously that is a sweeping statement.
Yeah. I think, you know, just because someone you know, might not have a diagnosis doesn't mean, you know, they're not are it or have it. It's just, yeah, it just may not be recognized yet.
Yeah, I mean, last year in the Facebook group, we had an 83-year-old woman who just had her diagnosis after her daughter and her granddaughter were diagnosed. So,
That's
you know, 83, it's never too late.
no,
It's never too late.
because again, I suspect you know, family members are who never got recognized. And yeah, if I think, you know, if some of them were still alive now, some of them only did die a few years ago, I do wonder if they would have known or would have realized later in life. But yeah, we'll never know now.
No, we'll never know. And, you know, in a sense, it doesn't matter But it's good to know, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sinead says that was very clear and comprehensive. Thank you. Sam says, socializing. How do you balance autistic anxiety with the excitement required of ADHD, especially with making new friends?
Oh, really good question. So I guess I would say for myself, the anxiety is far more dominant than the excitement. I think I only get excited, probably not even at the first stage, but like when a friendship really develops. And then that's when I kind of experience, I guess, perhaps more excitement of having a new friend. So for me, they kind of come at different points. So it's really, so again, I guess maybe that's how I balance it is, I kind of probably have more of the anxiety first and then the excitement comes later. But again, I wouldn't say I've probably necessarily experienced those two things at the same time.
I think it probably also changes with different stages of your life as well. I think the older that you get, the less, I usually say the less tosses I give. The older you get, the less you care about what people think about you.
Yeah.
And therefore it makes the whole social situation a bit easier in that you're not, it's not like this shark pool that you're trying to navigate, which is what it can feel like as a
Oh,
neurodivergent younger person.
definitely.
But
And even
it becomes less intimidating, I suppose.
yeah, and if I even think back to my younger years, like when I was developing a friendship with someone, I remember like again being like almost probably more overexcited, or because I was like, oh, someone's being nice to me, and that wasn't my norm. Most people weren't. So then again, people can seem like, oh my God, this person's amazing because they like me. But then again, there is a flip side to that, that you kind of maybe idolize people before you really know them, just because they're the only one who's not being horrible to you. I think that's definitely a big part of it as well, especially when you're younger. I think that's something when I look back now that really stands out. And again, I don't think that's just from being neurodivergent. I think that's being from a neurodivergent person who was really badly bullied
Yeah,
at
and
school.
being bullied obviously changes you. Yeah, and of course it would. Okay. Rita says, I don't have any questions, but I really appreciate the way you shared a bit of your experience. Lived experience is so helpful. It makes people feel less lonely and lost.
Oh,
Yes,
thank you, Rita.
it does. The next question is schooling. How did you move beyond your experience of school so you're not carrying that trauma every day?
Oh, I'm still carrying it every day. If I'm being honest, I definitely haven't moved on. I'm 29 now. Again, I think one day I will go to therapy and deal with it. But I think also one way of dealing with it is a lot of what I write. It's one way of getting it out. All that was suppressed in for so long. I mean, I know I've shared about it a lot on my Twitter, and really being critical and advocating around that. So again, it's me. I'm almost like, right, I want to make sure other people don't go through what I went through, because that's not okay. So again, I think that's one thing where again it's kind of driven that like, right, we need to do something about this, we need to call things out that are not right when in education. So again, I think that is definitely part of it, and I think it's definitely lessened it, but it's not the full solution. Like there's still trauma there that definitely needs to be dealt with for myself. But yeah, I think there's a lot to it. I mean, I think I definitely want to write more about schools in general at some point. But yeah, I think there's still a long way to go. And I know I won't be the only person who feels similarly about that.
No, definitely not. The next question is, how can I support my preteen daughter to gain independence, such as traveling to school with a friend, while also taking into consideration her needs and difficulties? For example, she can't tell the time and doesn't understand how to use money, but she also wants to experience what her friends are doing and go out on her own. She's going to a specialist provision school for secondary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I guess what you're trying to balance there is, and again, is what she wants to do, and her needs. Again, obviously, I don't know your daughter, but what I would probably suspect doing is kind of having perhaps that conversation with her, or perhaps doing kind of some of that preparation with her before, or helping her to kind of develop those skills. Whether that's in the school holidays, may be helpful, so then she can do those things with her friends. But I appreciate that won't be not everyone may be able to have those skills, or it could be really difficult, or it could take a really long time to get to that point. Obviously, as well, what I would say is it probably depends like what type of activities you're doing. So it's thinking about perhaps traveling to school independently is an option yet, but are there other things that she could perhaps do independently with friends? Maybe it's thinking a little bit more creatively, or if she is going to do something independently, that you're on backup, and that you've got phones set up, systems, or perhaps you're just around the corner. So again, I think it's thinking about a little bit about those things as well, or maybe just starting off really small, perhaps going down to the local shop by yourself, preparing for that if you need to before, and then gradually building it up. But yeah, I think perhaps those are the few starting places to start, but obviously you'll know your daughter better in terms of what may be the right option there.
Yeah, and if she's going to a specialist school, she's probably got an EHCP, in which case I would ask the local authority about travel training. You've said she's preteen. I can't remember what age they start travel training. It might be a little bit later. But you could start your own travel training, by which I mean, doing that route that she would go to school on, doing it in the summer holiday. If she's going to school in September, doing it now a few times before you go with her, so that at least that aspect of it is not brand new. So at least she knows what the journey is like, and she starts to recognize, key points in the journey, so that that part of it is not so anxiety inducing. But if she's going with friends, then they probably will scaffold her quite a lot. That's what we tend to find. So in a survey in the Autistic Girls Network Facebook group, we found that the period that was most difficult, if somebody wasn't diagnosed, the period that was most difficult was February half term of year 7. But actually, if they went to secondary school with lots of their friends, that really scaffolded things. For example, my daughter didn't get really bad for my daughter until she was in year 8, but she was in a feeder school, so she moved up with half of her school to secondary school, and she had 2 of her best friends with her in her class, and that meant that she never had to find her way to the next class, which might be on the other side of the school, on her own. She always had somebody with her helping her with that. They might not have known that they were helping her, but they were scaffolding her. And that kind of kept it going a bit longer. So you may find that the friends are helpful with that.
Yeah,
and I appreciate it's difficult.
Yeah, but to say, because I remember something my dad did with me. He did it with both me and my sister. My sister's neurotypical. Is he would, again, from a really young age, he always used to test our knowledge of the train stations, like whenever we'd get a train somewhere, from such a young age. So it was really ingrained in us really young in terms of where to go, how to find places, how to navigate things. And again, that wasn't really like an autism or neurodivergent thing. It's just, again, something we did, both of us. And so probably from quite a young age, I think we knew our ways around like train lines.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is when something unusual happens, isn't it? When might not be a crisis, but something happens. The train breaks down, the train is cancelled when you're there and you can't come back. All of those things are quite difficult, and especially if you were a preteen, that would obviously be really difficult to navigate. If it was a school bus, then the school would be sorting that out. If the bus didn't turn up at school or something, they shouldn't be letting anybody just leave. So hopefully there will be an element of scaffolding at the school. Yes, Charlotte says, yeah, we're doing travel training ourselves. LA don't help until 16 years old. Yes. And of course, preparing for adulthood is meant to be in an EHCP after the age of 14.
Yeah.
So as far as I'm concerned, travel training ought to start then, but there we go. I am not in charge of LA budgets, which is probably just as well. I don't want to be in charge of LA budgets.
If I'm being honest as well, I have been aware of special schools doing it from around that age travel training. So sometimes it will be part of the class, like, right, we're going to get to the train, and they do it as like a whole class activity within a special school. But again, that will probably massively vary depending on what school you're in and what they're offering.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, some special schools do a lot more kind of preparing for adulthood type stuff. You know, we looked around one that had they had a kitchen and washing machine, and they had, lessons about loading the washing machine, etc. So things can be different, but as you say, I'm sure that really varies from school to school. Okay, right. So we're going to leave it there, and it's exactly 9 o'clock. How fantastic is that? So hold your book up again, Sarah, so we can see the cover, and I will put, if I can get in there, I will put a link to it on Amazon. It's a really, really long link for some reason. It's given it tracking.
I don't know if it's maybe because it's a long title and you include the subtitle as well, maybe.
Yeah, but if you click on it, it will take you there. It is an Amazon link, I'm afraid. So if you hate Amazon, you will need to find it elsewhere.
About to say it's available in most bookshops online.
Yes.
I know a few Waterstones have it in some of the major cities as well. I think Foyles in London, I know, had it at Charing Cross. I'm not sure of anywhere else, but I know there are bookshops around that do have it in stock as well, if you want to buy it in person. I can't speak for outside, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. My dogs will be pleased that we're finishing. If you can hear her, she's getting a little bit louder. So we will stop now, and I will remove her from the room. But thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.